Hello, I'm Lynn May. Welcome to SnapShot and the American Air Power Museum at Republic Airport in Farmingdale. It was here that more than 9,000 P-47 Thunderbolts were built and sent out to defeat the German Luftwaffe in World War II. Today, these fighters are veterans in their own right, and in this unique setting, we honor the memory of our shared experiences of the war and consider the lessons of history. Join us next for a look at life after the war in Part 4 of our 5-part special edition of SnapShot.
Everybody wanted to be in the service.
It's like doing a day's job.
We loved our buddies like we loved our families.
It's a terrible thing to have somebody in the war.
I never experienced anything like it before in my life.
I get home about 10 o'clock in the morning. She made a big breakfast for me, and we lived in a tenement in Brooklyn on the 2nd floor, and ding, ding, the bell is ringing. So my father goes to the door, he says, "Yes, Western Union, telegram." Okay, so I'll go down and get it. He went down and got it. He opens it up. Navy Department. We're sorry to tell you, but your son is amongst the, what do you call it, missing. Well, good thing my mother, that I was home. My mother would have had a heart attack.
So one night, I'll forget, we went bowling with a bunch of my friends, and I was sitting down at the bowling center, the counter over there. I don't know if you know, like the old the diners, yeah, some of them are like. And then there was this fellow who said to me, he said, "Hey, what's the matter?" He says, "You don't look too happy." So I said, "Well, not really." So I said, "What's wrong with you?" I said, you know, I just got out of the service and this and that. And so then he said, he said, "If you feel sorry for yourself," he said, "no one else will ever feel sorry for you." And he said, "You better get out of what's on your mind, and you'll find that you'll be a lot happier." And that woke me up.
I was traveling on the 3rd Avenue L. At that time, it was up in New York. I was going to the veterans, and in doing so, there was a man on there that was drunk. And he was cursing and everything and going after a young girl. And there's an elderly couple who were afraid. So I saw the girl. I says, "Do me a favor. On the next station, we come, hold the door for me." So sure enough, she held the door. I'm sorry to say this, but I hit him. I whacked him down, took the drunk out, took him out and put him out on the platform. Then we went on our way. But that's how I was always. You come back like that with a chip on your shoulder.
When we listen to veterans, we wonder if we can find some answers in their stories. Can an old warrior's memories carry lessons for those serving today? How did World War II change us? Was WW2 a necessary war? Let's get a historian's perspective from Mike Wallace. He is the co-author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning Gotham, A History of New York City to 1898. Two-part question. One, do you believe World War II was a necessary war? And looking back on it from this perspective, do we idealize it?
If I had been on the scene, I would have been a vigorous anti-fascist, and I would have thought this was an essential war. It's important to remember that in the years before the war, the overwhelming majority of the United States did not want to get involved in a European war. After it started in '39, we still didn't want to get involved in it. It's not just that the various nationalities that had, kin involved on the other side were reluctant. It was politically. I mean, many people thought this was, another European conflict. We got suckered in last time to the First World War, and it was a horrible experience. We're not going to get sucked in again. And it's really a competition between British imperialists and German imperialists over who gets to rule over, colored peoples around the planet.
Yeah.
Let's stay out of this one.
Mm-hmm.
So
nothing to do with us.
It was very late in the game that, in fact, that turned around. And then questions, in fact, that had been important, like imperialism on the part of the Europeans, and then maybe us, vanished. One has to approach it with caution. It was a tremendous watershed. There's no question about that in the history of the United States, and certainly in the history of New York City. In a nutshell, the United States, which had been really, before the First World War, still a third world country. It had been a debtor nation. the balance begins to move in the First World War, but it's really only at the end of the Second World War that the United States emerges as this colossus.
Huge economic
And
power.
it's a military power and it's a financial power. And New York City becomes the capital of the world. The United Nations doesn't just land here accidentally.
Do you think that contributes to our seeming to idealize it because it was so beneficial to us as a country?
Well, yes, but, you know, also in a funny way, the kinds of struggles that took place during, even before the war, when A. Philip Randolph in New York City organizes a march on Washington, not the one we think about in '63, but this one before the war, because in fact, while defense plants were starting up, the Depression was being wiped out, they weren't hiring black people. And he said, we're going to put 100,000 black people in Washington and demonstrate. And this was very embarrassing to the Roosevelt administration because we are anti-fascist. We're going to fight an anti-fascist war. And these guys are saying, excuse me,
Hello.
Excuse me, this looks like fascism, what's happening here in South Carolina. Jews, this was a vigorously anti-Semitic country. There were heart-rending efforts to get the quota system at least suspended to allow refugees from Nazism to come in. This was not done. And intriguingly, during the war, an alliance is struck between Jews and blacks, both of them feeling powerless in the situation. And they passed some of the first legislation requiring no discrimination and access to jobs in New York State, the Ives-Quinn Act of 1945, which is what Jackie Robinson gets his job on the basis of. The law has in fact been changed. So this is a turnabout in that sense, but it's also a turnabout in the direction of, in prior wars, after the war, the military went home. Bye, we're disbanding. The military did not. The Pentagon gets built. Washington emerges as a massive power in its own right, which it had never been before. New York, although it's going to emerge as the financial capital and the global political capital and the cultural capital and the media capital, is not going to be the military capital. And what's emerging, in fact, is, although, and now we're much more upfront about calling it that, an American empire. Exactly. And those are the two twin capitals of it that emerge. One last thing that is also a watershed is that there was a big battle about how the production operations of this war were going to be organized. And the decision was made basically by a collection of a collection of corporate executives, Wall Street bankers.
Interesting slip of the tongue.
Yes, well, but what it is this, that in the 1930s, I would argue, a whole squadron of New Yorkers went down with Franklin Roosevelt to Washington, and they ran the New Deal. A new squadron of New Yorkers goes down once the war starts from Wall Street, and they run the war. And the way they run the war is, well, what their argument is that, listen, this is a capitalist country. You're not going to be able to get the big corporations to get involved in this war, and they weren't. They were fighting. They didn't want to stop. They didn't want to stop turning out Chrysler cars. The Depression's over. We got tons of money to be made in automobiles. Why build tanks? They had to be, you know, really badgered into undertaking this. But once it happened, the alliance between the big corporations and the now big military, this was the forerunner of the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower talked about in the 1950s. That Eisenhower
warned us against.
So all of this stems from the war.
Elie Wiesel said, whoever survives a test, whatever it may be, must tell the story. That is his duty. Our next guest tells his incredible story of survival among the Nazis as a blue-eyed Jewish boy and his feelings when he saw the Statue of Liberty for the first time.
I was born in 1934 in Brussels. Our country was invaded in early 1940. There was some pressures that were starting to be built up by the Germans in regards to people who were Jewish. And my father decided that we should leave Brussels. We left everything there. We just walked out and went on a train. So we went to Genval, and there was a little house in the woods that was available for rent. After we were there, one night, my father heard someone yelling, help, help. And he finally went out, and we were surrounded by lakes there, and he saw a gentleman drowning in the lake, and he pulled him out and brought him back to the house that we were renting. And it turns out that he was a local priest who had made the wrong turn and had walked into the lake and just couldn't get out. And so we sort of saved his life a little bit. And we took care of him for that night. And the next day he asked, what can I do for you? And my father said to him, you could give my son Catholic papers that he's a Catholic, and that could save his life. And I became Charles Bontemps at that time for the rest of the war. Things were getting worse in Belgium, and we had heard there was a priest in a town called Namur who was helping Jewish children as Jewish men in placing them in orphanages and things like that. And my father decided that the time had arrived for our family to really split up because it was getting a bit dangerous. So we went to Namur, and this priest, Vicaire André, placed me in a Catholic orphanage. The name of the orphanage was called Saint Jean de Dieu. And we split up, and I never saw my father again. And my mother had left as well, but it turns out that the priest, Vicaire André, placed her in the same orphanage that I was in. My mother was a seamstress. I could see her sometimes, but we really never had any contact.
She was able to save Charles because she was so lovely looking, because she was so aware of what was going on. She would be a maid in a German home here that there was going to be a raid. She would take Charles out of that orphanage, get him into another orphanage. How she was able to, there were a lot of people running from the Germans. She was able to get him in somewhere else.
In early 1944, she came again and took me to Namur, which was a town in southeast Belgium, where she worked as a domestic. And it turned out that this particular house was also the headquarters of the underground. They gave me a bicycle, and I would ride around and look at railroad stations and tell them what type of German train movements there were, and so on and so forth. August of 1944, we were liberated by the Third Army, which was General Patton's army. Then she decided that really we should move out of the city and go and live in the country. But unfortunately, in December of 1944, the Germans initiated a counterattack, and we were right in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge. But fortunately, in early January of 1945, the sun came out, and the bombers came out, and that's when we were liberated. We had some cousins here and an uncle, two uncles, and they asked us to come over as tourists. I knew it was America because I had seen a picture of the Statue of Liberty. And in fact, any time that I travel and I came back on a plane or on a ship and I saw the Statue of Liberty, I knew it was home. My mother gave me two births, the original and America.
Charles Schrebnick came to New York as a young boy and became an investment banker and a co-founder of the biotech company Genetic Engineering. Many returning war survivors and veterans came here to make a new life. Professor Chuck Howlett joins us again to talk about the post-war boom and how we grew. Chuck, let's talk a little bit about after the war and here on Long Island, New York, and in some sense all over the entire country. This was a war where the soldiers came home as heroes. What happened to them next?
Well, clearly, many of them, and I can speak from my father's recollections, they just wanted to get back to living a normal life. The stress of war, the stress of combat was something that they wanted to put behind them. For many, they were able to do that successfully. For others, it was not so easy. But the government very smartly introduced the GI Bill in 1943 or 44 that was designed to make the transition from military life to civilian life far more amenable to the veterans. And by providing low housing income loans, by providing an opportunity to attend college.
And we must mention Levittown here, because this was the part of the country that built some of the first, most efficient, many of which are still being lived in houses.
Right. Well, a couple of historians, such as Kenneth Jackson from Columbia and Barbara Kelly from Hofstra, have done a great deal with discussing the role of crabgrass frontier, or the Levittowns. And specifically, this was to provide affordable housing, cooker-cutting houses, if you'd like, that would help them, get back to a civilian life, which led to the post-war boom that really made the economy grow. I would say, I could argue also that the Cold War mentality would also play a role in providing jobs for many of the veterans in defense plants, such as Republic Aviation here on Long Island and Grumman. Many of those people did go from the military life to working in defense plants.
And it provided, through the GI Bill, as you mentioned, college educations for more people, many of whom could not have gone
Let me
otherwise.
address that one for you, Lynn. One of my closest friends and my department chair, when I was a public school teacher, Ralph Foreman, had lost his leg at Remagen in Germany. When he returned after being rehabilitated, and interestingly, he met his wife, who was in the Women's Army Corps at Walter Reed Hospital.
Really?
And she kind of nursed him back to health, and they got married. And he was from Garden City, went to teach in Amityville High School after the war through the GI Bill. The money that he got from his disability, along with the GI Bill, enabled him to go to Hofstra University, where he got his undergraduate degree and his master's at Teachers College, Columbia. And then from there, he went into public school teaching. So there's a very clear example of that.
There were some problems, though, for some of the returning veterans. Now, we have to mention, when we talk about Levittown, that African Americans did not qualify, were not allowed to take advantage of that. But let's talk about something that affected black, white, many people who went, and that is post-traumatic stress syndrome.
Yes.
Of course, they weren't calling it that then.
No, they weren't. I think probably the analogy that's used today with PTSD is shell shock. And there weren't many of these veterans that did experience that. Their story is largely one that's untold, and hopefully more and more of that will be discussed and will be brought out in various stories. But it's a big issue in terms of the veterans' hospitals dealing with those types of individuals. I guess one of the more celebrated examples of this is in the movie with George C. Scott and Patton, where the soldier in the hospital tent is afraid to go back to the front lines, and it created quite a stir. But this is largely a forgotten story that most people don't want to talk about, but it's one that should be discussed, clearly.
One of my very dear friends, he was a captain, United States Army Air Corps, World War II. And he piloted the B-17s in bombing raids over Germany. And one of his missions, he was shot down, and he was a prisoner of war for 9 months before he was freed by the Russians, okay? And years I've known this guy, we're talking. And one time, my wife happened to say about me with my waking up in the middle of the night hollering, So yes, what are you doing now? He said, "What, are you having dreams?" Yeah. He said, "Why don't you go to the VA?" He says, "Maybe you can get some assistance or something." I never would have thought about it. So I went to what they called, which I belong to, an organization, a great organization, the DAV, Disabled American Veterans, okay? And they did all the legwork for me. So they got me to have an interview with a doctor, and I was diagnosed as having post-traumatic stress disorder, which I didn't know I had.
After the troops come home, there is often yet another price to pay. In World War II, it was called battle fatigue. Today, we call it post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. But no matter what we call it, it can ruin lives.
I was 19 when I joined the Navy. We were deployed around the world 3 times. We did a straight 77-day underway, and for those 77 days, we were only on the surface for 3 days total to transit through very shallow areas, and Other than that, you know, more than 90% of us never got to see any of the sunlight. Being isolated wasn't the hard part. It was not being able to communicate with anybody about anything. That was the hard part. I was discharged February 3rd, 2007. Almost immediately when I got out of the Navy was where I started realizing I had a problem. The biggest thing that's starting to happen now is that I'm having outbursts of anger for almost no reason. There are certain situations that would never have bothered me before, but now it makes me so short-wired that I will yell and scream when there's no reason to. I was never diagnosed with PTSD, but through my family, my girlfriend, and a couple of other people, they could tell that I have some degree of it, but I'm just still in denial because I don't want to just jump out there and say, oh, I'm crazy, I'm loony, but PTSD doesn't mean that. But, you know, that's the biggest reason why I'm in denial, is I don't want to be diagnosed as having a problem. I think that a lot of people are just worried about how people will see them, so they're afraid to get the help.
Since I was a very young kid, I was always running around playing Army games, wearing camouflage and stuff like that. I didn't have plans to go to college, so enlisting was the way to go for me. When I finally enlisted, it was a very proud moment. I remember the day that I watched my name get sewed onto my BDUs was just, you know, an exhilarating experience because I knew I was really in. I went to Sadr City in northern Baghdad, and when I first got there, it was just a very shocking experience. There was a lot of instances where, you know, we were in immediate danger. My platoon was actually pretty lucky in terms of IEDs, and we didn't take any serious casualties while we were over there. But you start to lose sensitivity to getting shot at after a while. I mean, the first couple times I can remember very clearly, and after that it seems to be less important. As part of my job, I was taking pictures of everything that we did and everything that we encountered, so that I could pass it on, and it would go through the intelligence channels. And that sometimes involved taking pictures of dead bodies and stuff like that, which is kind of an image that's going to be forever burned into my mind. I still remember the first time that I ever encountered a mass grave. There was 16 policemen who had been tortured and assassinated. And it's a day that I can remember clearly. The smells, the look of all the people that were around there. It was just it was a horrible experience. I came home December 26th, 2005. The nightmares that I used to have, or that I do have, didn't start until about 6 months after I got back. I've had problems with anxiety and depression, which actually got as bad as I had a suicide attempt back in May, which is actually why I was removed from the military. My friends and family were always trying to help me. They've all been saying since I got back that I'm a different person and stuff. They've been trying to push me to seek counseling since I first got home from Iraq. I definitely have come out with a lot of scars, but I've grown very much and I've matured a lot. And I believe that the things that I experienced have made me a much better person. The counseling has helped me speak to more people who experience the same thing that I have. It makes you feel a lot less alone.
If you think you or a loved one suffers from PTSD, please talk to your doctor and get the help you deserve. We'll be back again next week for the final episode in this 5-part special series on World War II. Join us then for Witness and Memorial. I'm Lynn May, and thank you for watching, and we leave you with these closing thoughts from our own Warren Barry. Good night.
Battle fatigue, peace fatigue. Fatigue seems to set in once the last shot is fired. Everyone has to speak for him or herself. So what did I learn from World War II? Well, I don't know if we Americans are blessed or not, but I do know we're very lucky. Look at the way we emerged from the big war. I guess that's a blessing. No war is spontaneous. The roots of war are planted long before the first shot is fired. World War II grew out of World War I, out of the peace settlement. And the idea of a world war itself grew out of some stupid feuding among a bunch of coddled cousins who were called kings and kaisers, or commissars and capitalists, or emperors and warlords. Pride can be deadly. There is no such thing as a master race. In Germany, in Japan, and as we're slowly learning, even in America. Is there anything filthier than ethnic cleansing? And finally, whatever happened to that idea of the war to end all wars? Seems like that was about 6 or 7 wars ago, wasn't it? Talk about fatigue. You'd think the world would have grown tired of wars by now. This is Warren Berry.
I dedicate this portion of the program to all the men and women that have fallen in the 10th Armored Division and the other divisions that I helped form. And to all the ones that came home, even during the wars now, I wish them all lots of luck.